Hello. In the last video we talked about resonance in the real world with children on swings and guitar strings being plucked, and we discussed the fact that resonance is the relationship between two separate entities. When these entities oscillate in harmony with each other at the same frequency, then you get a resonant effect, you get a loud sound basically. The same kind of effect happens in electronics, and we see it manifested as the resonance knob in many analog synthesizers. We've got the ARP2600 here, classic synth from the 70s, and the reason I've chosen this synth is because the filter system in this synthesizer can operate independently. It doesn't need an oscillator as an input, and it doesn't need to be attached to an envelope. We've got the purity of a single component, and we can observe it in isolation. Having said that, we're going to start this demonstration today with an oscillator. I'm going to introduce a sawtooth wave into the system. So that nasty sound there, and we see it on span, is a sawtooth. The oscillator, VCO3 in this case, is generating a sawtooth wave. It's outputting that wave to the VCF, the voltage controlled filter, and that filter at the moment isn't doing anything with the signal, it's passing it straight on to the outside world. So what we're hearing there is a simple sawtooth wave being generated at a static frequency by this oscillator. We've not filtered anything and nothing is resonating. In order to show you the effects of resonance in an electronic system, I need to introduce a filter. So I'm going to have a low pass filter take some of the frequencies of this sound away. So we've got the low pass filter here operating at about 2.5 kilohertz, and you can see it's thrown away these upper frequencies. Okay, great so far. Still no demonstration of resonance. Now I'm going to begin to introduce resonance, and we'll see a spike at or around 2.5 kilohertz on the analyzer. See that? There's the spike. Bring it down again, no resonance. As resonance increases, we get this intense spike. As I change the cutoff frequency, the spike moves to track the current cutoff frequency. Whatever the cutoff frequency is, here we are at 700 Hertz. There's 660 is close enough. This is a very crude representation. There's only 4 harmonics in this signal. We'll go up here to 2.6 kilohertz. 2.64. That's pretty good. What's going on? Why have we got that spike in the filter? Well, it turns out there's a pretty deep rabbit hole we can jump down if we want to, and we can get into some fairly deep electronics. Beyond my understanding, I'm no electronics expert, but I'll try to explain the principles to you. Filters in analog synthesizers are these things called RLC circuits. Now, R stands for resistance, L stands for inductance, and C stands for capacitance. So we have a resistor, an inductor, and a capacitor. Those are 3 electronics components. If you don't want to worry about what they are, you don't need to. I'm going to explain their practical significance in the context of the filter. Now, the 2 really important components in the circuit are the capacitor and the inductor. They manifest different means of storing energy. The inductor is capable of storing magnetic energy, and the capacitor is capable of storing electrical energy. The capacitor and the inductor basically ping-pong energy backwards and forwards between each other. In the process of so doing, they generate a resonance at the cutoff point. Now, in order to explain how or why, I would need to solve second-order differential equations, which is way beyond my mathematical understanding. I can't do it, I'm not going to try. The fact is that the circuit is bouncing this energy backwards and forwards. The capacitor sends charge to the inductor. The inductor stores that as magnetic energy and then releases it, sends it back to the capacitor, which results in a resonance. So our synthesizer at the moment has a cutoff frequency of around about 2.6 kilohertz. We should be hearing a really sharp spike. Now we don't. Why don't we? Well, that's because of the resonance knob. When the resonance knob is turned all the way down and we get our completely standard sawtooth wave, a resistance is applied to the circuit, to the LC circuit. It's the R in the RLC circuit. A resistance is applied to the circuit, which basically suppresses that resonance. And if the resistance is applied across the entire frequency range, basically the resonance disappears. As we turn that resonance knob up, the frequency range, the bandwidth of the suppression reduces. What's actually happening is that the resonance increases proportional to the reduction in bandwidth. So basically, as we squash the bandwidth in, as we turn the resonance up and we squash this bandwidth in around the cutoff frequency in the center, the resonance comes back. If we didn't have a resistor in the circuit at all, the resonance would be there at maximum. And so it's the resistance that's suppressing the resonance, and as the bandwidth over which the resistance is applied decreases, the resonance increases. So let's bring the oscillator back in, start increasing the resonance, and you can see there's a lot of complex maths going on there. The frequencies on both sides of the cutoff range are being suppressed, and they're basically like being squashed into the resonance point. And the more we increase this knob, the more intense the resonance becomes. Now there's a point at which if I turn that knob up far enough, the filter itself is capable of actually generating its own sine tone. Let's do it. It can be a little bit unpleasant. I'll just turn the volume down just in case it catches you out. There it is. Let's bring that back in now. So that's a single sine wave at 2.6 odd kilohertz. There you go, 2.2648 is the cutoff frequency. The filter is generating its own tone. Now just take a moment to think about that. There's no input from the oscillator here. The filter's receiving power. It's a powered circuit, but it's not receiving an oscillating control voltage. There's no input being fed into this voltage controlled filter. The RLC circuit itself, the low pass filter, as a function of its existence, by nature of the fact that the inductor and the capacitor are capable of passing energy backwards and forwards to each other, and that there's a resonance around the cutoff point, this basically bouncing backwards and forwards is an oscillation. When we increase that resonance towards the maximum range that the synthesizer is capable of generating, the filter itself generates a tone. Now if I bring the oscillator back in, you can see that the oscillator is feeding energy into the filter, and now the resonant spike gets bigger, it gets more energy, gets more excited, and is able to resonate more. So that's the oscillator at maximum and the filter at maximum resonance, and now this horrible sound is dominating the frequency range, but we still have the rest of the sawtooth wave operating in the background. The moment I pull the resonance back, let's find out if it's still self-oscillating. No, it isn't. Everything that we're hearing there, it's still really intense, and that spike is way, way higher than any of the other harmonics in the sound, but that's not self-oscillation. That energy is coming from the oscillator. the filter itself hasn't got to the point where its own internal circuitry is capable of generating its own tone. Now you need to be aware of self-oscillation, because if synthesizers are capable of doing it, you might get this unexpected and unwanted artifact when you stop playing the keyboard. It's a little bit like microphone feedback. Nobody's standing at the microphone and yet there's this horrible screech. So self-oscillation can be analogous to that, and if you don't know where it's coming from or why it's happening, then it can catch you out. So that's why the control in an analog synthesizer is called resonance. Very often the knob itself will be labelled Q. It's not just a random letter from the alphabet, it stands for quality factor, and it's a mathematical relationship between the frequency and the bandwidth. It's frequency divided by bandwidth, and we use a Q factor rather than a fixed bandwidth because the bandwidth between 100 Hz and 200 Hz is a different ratio of the total frequency range than it would be if it was between 5000 Hz and 5200 Hz. By having a Q factor, we're able to scale the ratio of the bandwidth that's being applied to the resonance cutoff point, and it scales throughout the frequency range. Hope you found that useful. If you did, please consider subscribing, hit notifications, and you find out when the rest of my content comes out. I hope to see you then. Thanks very much.